It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third annual Keller Keynote Lecture in Theology and Oratory. The Reverend Dr. Christoph Keller III, an Episcopal priest and theologian, founded the SUMMA Theological Debate Society for high school students out of a belief that knowledge and reason are key building blocks for a life of faith, and that by exploring life's biggest questions through theological debate, we can broaden our understanding of Christianity and its enduring power to deepen faith, hope, and love. Dr. Keller directed the first SUMMA camp in 2012 and served as the camp's principal lecturer in both theology and debate until his retirement in 2023, last year. At the conclusion of last year's camp, a resolution was read in honor of Dr. Keller's devotion to forming young people in exploration of those big questions, and in recognition of his work for the founding of this program and in honor of his love for our Lord Jesus Christ. SUMMA's annual keynote lecture was named in his honor, the Keller Keynote in Theology and Oratory. Accordingly, Keller lecturers are invited each year to amplify the virtue of faith-seeking understanding. Welcome. It's good to be with you this evening. Everyone in the room, I think, knows me, but for those joining online, I'm Warren Swinson. I am the Associate Program Director for the SUMMA Theological Debate Camp. I'm also the camp chaplain this week, and it's a delight to welcome those of you here from afar to our time together. This year it's also a delight to welcome those of you in the room. But I realize some of you had, not quite the same choice, so. No disrespect. This year we welcome as our lecturer, Dr. Andrew Thompson. Dr. Thompson is Associate Professor of Theological Ethics and Director of the Center for Religion and Environment at the School of Theology here at the University of the South. Dr. Thompson earned his PhD in religion from Yale University and a Master of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School. As an undergraduate at Duquesne University, Dr. Thompson studied music performance. I understand he's quite the saxophone player. Prior to coming to Sewanee, Dr. Thompson served as an Episcopal missionary in El Salvador, where with his wife, the Reverend Lee Preston, he helped establish a school and a rural mission. About Sewanee, Dr. Thompson said, "This is such an amazing place to teach about creation care. We have the opportunity to learn theology in our classrooms, in our books, from the Bible, and to experience theology out in creation, out in the woods, out on the trails, and to understand critically the implications of how to put that theology into action in caring for these natural spaces." Dr. Thompson is the author of 2 books. His most recent, Reconsider the Lilies, Challenging Christian Environmentalism's Colonial Legacy, which addresses whiteness in Christian environmentalism, was published last year by Fortress Press and is available for purchase this evening, I might add. Dr. Thompson joins us this evening to deliver a talk entitled Worldmaking and Environmental Reparations. It's an honor, it's a privilege to welcome Dr. Thompson. Please join me in doing so.
Thank you. I'm going to begin by thanking Melody and Warren for this invitation. I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak with y'all. Thank you, Warren, for that maybe a little too thorough introduction. And I'm grateful to the folks from the bookstore, too, for setting up this evening and having my book and a couple of other books available there. And thank you to all of you and those who are present online for being here, whether you had the choice or not. Last year, the Center for Religion and Environment, which I direct, together with the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation, and Sewannee's Integrated Program in the Environment, together embarked on what I am calling an experiment in world-making. We began cultivating relationships with community groups and projects in central Louisiana, in an area where some of the university's major founding donors owned plantations and enslaved hundreds of people, with an eye to environmental reparations. By environmental reparations, what I mean is efforts to increase the political agency and improve the ecological health of communities harmed by the legacies of the economy of slavery, from which this university benefited and indeed still benefits. I'm going to develop this idea as we go, but the kind of work that we have in mind with this project and the groups with whom we are working are efforts that tackle the joint political and environmental oppression that allows toxic waste in poor communities of color, or projects that reimagine agriculture in ways that empower Black farmers as alternatives to the industrial agricultural system that is a direct descendant of plantation agriculture. In other words, these are projects that directly confront the particular configuration of extractivist consumption and racist ideology, I'm going to say more about that, that has been called the Capitalocene, or capitalist world ecology. And I'm going to describe all of that in greater detail in a moment. Confronting that world ecology, which has literally made the world that we live in, requires us to remake the world, according to the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo. So today, in this context, for this Keller lecture in the middle of theological debate camp, I want to propose and defend a claim that is debatable, that Sewannee and institutions like it should engage in the work of environmental reparations. To do this, I want to explore this image from philosopher Olufemi Taiwo, this image of reparations as world-making, through the lens of our work that we've begun in central Louisiana. Specifically, I'm going to argue that environmental reparations represent a transformative approach to justice that responds to the injustices of the Capitalocene by remaking the world. I'll begin by describing this idea of a capitalist world ecology, the historical emergence of an ideology of extractivist racial capitalism that is epitomized in monocrop plantation agriculture, which underwrote the US economy, including, of course, this institution. Against this backdrop of racial capitalism, what does justice require? I'll consider accounts of justice that motivate different arguments for reparations, including the transformative account that supports the idea of world-making. This world-making, in turn, leads to a focus on environmental justice issues and environmental reparations, as the work in central Louisiana will illustrate. 1, capitalist world ecology. My argument tonight for environmental reparations centers around Olufemi Taiwo's claim that if slavery and colonialism built the world and its current basic stream of social injustice, the proper task of social justice is no smaller. It is, quite literally, to remake the world. The first question then is, in what sense did slavery and colonialism build the economic and ideological world that we inhabit? The emergence of capitalism in what is called the long 16th century required, according to historian Jason Moore, the geographical expansion of colonialism together with what he calls an agroecological transformation, the transformation of the land under the plantation system into what he describes as a capitalist world ecology. So this term, capitalist world ecology, names the way a global economic system was made possible by transforming life, whole places with their human and more than human species, transforming all of that into interchangeable commodities. Monocrop plantation agriculture, that is, massive plantations of a single crop, transformed the bodies of the soil and the bodies of enslaved human beings into resources that could be expended, used up, and replaced. These transformations have then produced the physical, economic, and ideological world that we inhabit today. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were both especially profitable and especially destructive of both the soil and of the bodies of enslaved human workers. After sugar and an insatiable appetite for timber, after that came tobacco and then cotton plantations in North America, and particularly in the North American South. The economy of slavery and monocrop agriculture encouraged one another because large plantations of a single cash crop required less specialization, were easier to control a large number of enslaved persons. So the complexity of labor could be simplified by simplifying the land into huge monocrop plantations. This is what Moore describes as capital's tendency to radically simplify land and labor. Among the main agents of this transformation were corporations and the military, and at times those two things were virtually indistinguishable. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "It was cheaper to buy an acre of new land than to manure an old one." And the only reason that this was the case was because of the ongoing conquest of the land through military force. Throughout the colonial project, this military power was exercised on behalf of corporations and sometimes by the corporations themselves, which had their own literal armies. The corporations would then speculate, invest in massive expanses of this stolen land, which were then divided into huge plantations to be tilled and harvested by legions of stolen people. Founding politicians and governors like Thomas Jefferson were among the shareholders of these companies, and so worked to advance their interests in policy and in warfare. Thinking then about reparations and contemporary efforts towards justice today, it's important to note that the effects, the ecological effects and the social and economic effects of this system persist. It's not just historical injustice. Monocrop plantations, like in plantation agriculture, lack the natural protections of diverse ecological communities, so they're more sensitive to drought and to flood. Large swaths of plowed land are more conducive to simplified management, they're easier to control, but they're also more prone to soil erosion. The exhaustion and the erosion of plantations during the slave period transferred millions of tons of southern topsoil to the Chesapeake and to the Gulf of Mexico. So now many of the areas that had the highest concentrations of large plantations and enslaved workers now remain unable to support productive agriculture today. The soil is still exhausted. After the end of slavery, those depleted farmlands, together with economic, political, and physical violence, made subsistence agriculture impossible for the newly freed slaves and the descendants of those newly freed slaves. And some of the families that we met in Louisiana when we went down there told us precisely this story across generations of their families being enslaved, being freed from slavery, and not being able to eke out a subsistence on the land for all of these reasons. At the same time, with each move westward for so-called fresh soil, the violent expropriation of the land from indigenous peoples by these militarized corporations virtually eradicated the regenerative forms of agriculture that those peoples practiced. And so that left scars on the land as well. So the scars of slavery and colonialism persist not only on the communities of the South, but on the land itself. The moral claims for reparations that I'm going to describe in a minute are not only about past wrongs, but are about enduring ones, wrongs that persist today. More significantly, though, capitalist world ecology transformed the political and economic systems in ways that continue. Its basic pattern of the radical simplification of land and labor on monocrop plantations sustained by military force establishes some of the key characteristics that continue to define capitalism today, which can be described as extractivist racial capitalism, for its seemingly limitless exploitation of both the natural world and of marginalized groups defined along racial lines. As Moore says, The very hallmarks of capitalism's present-day environmental degradation, especially monocultural production, were inscribed in the colonial enterprise, itself little more than a great machine designed for the transformation of ecological into monetary wealth. Here, at a university founded by slaveholding churchmen, it's important to remember that the transformations of this capitalist world ecology were accompanied by ideological and theological justifications. The theologian Willie James Jennings argues that the economic and agricultural transformations in the Americas were supported by what he calls a theology of enclosure. That is, a theology that drew boundaries across and through places and peoples to create races, properties, and commodities, supposedly as part of God's providence, of God's plan for the world. The counterpart, says Jennings, to the soldier and the merchant was the missionary. At the same time that the soldier and the merchant used force to transform land and people into property, the missionary gave religious sanction to those efforts. Theologian Kelly Brown Douglas has shown how a similar theological construction of white identity and providence supported the expansionist project in North America specifically. The fictitious identity of Anglo-Saxons as God's chosen people was mobilized to justify white supremacy, colonization, and later manifest destiny, the idea that God willed white people to occupy the whole continent of North America. Crucially, for both of these accounts, Douglas and Jennings, the church was deeply implicated in both the ideology and the institution of landed property from the beginning. This is perhaps nowhere more true than in Virginia, which was an Anglican colony, and the Episcopal Church that Sewanee represents has come out of the Anglican tradition. Virginia was the primary locus of colonial plantation agriculture. So the active participation of the church, and specifically of the Anglican, that is now the Episcopal Church, in the early emergence of this racial capitalist system is directly relevant to this project of environmental reparations. Two, the demands of justice. So the story of slavery and plantation agriculture is central to the formation of the world that we currently inhabit, the ideological and religious world, as much as the geophysical and social and political worlds. The comprehensiveness of this transformation of worlds affected by the capitalist world ecology has led some authors to suggest a new name for this era in world history. While some scholars have taken to calling this the Anthropocene epoch, to name the fact that human beings, anthropos, are the dominant force transforming the world, Jason Moore and others suggest that it should be called the Capitalocene. Rather than just human beings, or all human beings being the dominant force, these authors say the idea of the Capitalocene argues that it's capitalism itself that is transforming the globe to the benefit of some human beings at the expense of many, many other human beings and at the expense of the natural world. Or, as eco-feminist philosopher Donna Haraway describes it, to speak rightly of this current world, one must surely tell of the networks of sugar, precious metals, plantations, indigenous genocides, and slavery, with their labor innovations and relocations and recompositions of critters and things sweeping up both human and non-human workers of all kinds. And actually, Haraway also and others have also talked about the Plantationocene for a lot of the reasons that we're describing tonight. We're going to stick with the Capitalocene for tonight. So against this comprehensive backdrop of the Capitalocene, we can ask what justice requires in response. It seems unnecessary to develop a full theory of justice in order to show why some sort of reparative action is required. I'm going to take it as self-evident that the transformations of the Capitalocene, at the very least, the transformation of human beings into commodities, that is, into means towards others' ends, that those transformations are unjust by virtually any theory of justice. Instead, the important question is what different accounts or types of justice have to say about how we might address historical but enduring wrongs. So I'm not going to develop a full theory of justice, but in honor of Dr. Keller, who was a fan of Thomas Aquinas, I thought it would be worth considering what Thomas has to say about justice. And this is also because Thomas's thinking on justice continues to influence how Christians and non-Christians think about justice today. Thomas's account is thorough, is comprehensive, is extensive, and I'm only going to be able to touch on it here, but it is relevant to our contemporary views. For Thomas, justice is primarily about respecting the fundamental equality of all human beings and preserving the common good, preserving the good of the community as a whole. I should note, however, that all this insistence on equality did not stop Thomas himself from a qualified affirmation of the institution of slavery. Taken together, though, this emphasis on equality as human beings and on the common good mean that the goal of justice for Thomas is always about restoring right relationships with one another within the community as a whole. For Thomas, following Aristotle, there are two categories of this kind of justice: what he calls commutative justice, which is about what individuals owe to one another, and distributive justice, which is about how society distributes goods rightly. Keeping these two categories in mind, we can turn to contemporary accounts of justice and their relevance for the topic of reparations. Supporters of reparations advance a few different accounts of justice that fit broadly within these categories of Thomas Aquinas. And all of these share in different ways the goal of reconciling relationships, the relationships that have been sundered by injustice. These accounts are retributive and restorative justice, reconciliatory justice, and distributive or transformative justice. Retributive accounts of justice focus on appropriate punishment or restitution for past wrongs, and restorative accounts focus on repairing the harm done by those wrongs to the victims. Taken together, in the context of reparations, these two accounts of justice lead to what Taiwo describes as harm repair approaches to reparations, which argue that restoring relationships after the historical wrongs of slavery, colonialism, and racism requires that the perpetrators of these wrongs, and by extension their descendants, be held responsible for restoring the victims and their descendants to some level of well-being that they would have had were it not for these wrongs. In other words, some level of well-being they would have had slavery not existed and colonialism not existed. What Taiwo calls reconciliatory justice focuses more directly on the goal of restoring relationships. It sees reparative actions as a means to the end of restored relationships. On this account, reparations take the form of relationship repair. As he puts it, the various wrongdoings of slavery damage the moral relations that should sustain political and moral community between differently positioned inheritors of the moral legacy of slavery. Reparation, then, is about fixing these relationships. These approaches focus not on restoring a particular level of well-being, but on removing the political, social, and economic barriers to non-adversarial relationships between the descendants of victims and the descendants of victimizers. These conventional approaches are both examples of Thomas's broad category of commutative justice, justice between individuals, or here, between groups of individuals. They both have strengths and weaknesses, and Taiwo doesn't dismiss either of them. But he argues that a third approach, what he calls a constructive approach, or world-making, more fully responds to the history of racial capitalism that I've been describing. So as I said before, as I quoted before, if slavery and colonialism built the world and its current basic scheme of social injustice, the proper task of social justice is no smaller. It's quite literally to remake the world. That is, we need to ask what a truly just world would look like. What levels of political self-determination and social and economic and ecological flourishing do all communities have a right to? And then take the steps to make that world a reality. This approach is informed by history. The costs of building that new just world fall on those who inherit, quote, the moral liabilities of the institutions of slavery and colonialism. In other words, the descendants of enslavers and colonizers. But the focus here is forward-looking, toward a global community thoroughly structured by non-domination, as he puts it, where all are guaranteed a basic level of well-being. He rightly identifies this approach with distributive justice, because what we're talking about is the question of the just distribution of goods within society. But in light of the fundamental transformations that I've been describing of the Capitalocene epoch, I suggest that we can think of this as transformative justice, since what is required is not just restitution or restoration, not just the distribution of societal well-being, but a more radical transformation, a more radical reordering of the ideological and economic world created by colonialism and slavery. In practice, all of these approaches may look very similar. So practically speaking, may involve things like cash transfers or investment in communities. But the framing of them with different accounts of justice and the goals that they articulate make a difference in how these steps might be described or engaged, and particularly in how the relationships involved are approached. And I'll describe that more later. A final account of justice, though, that Taiwo's constructive approach has a lot of connections and resonances with, is what's called environmental justice. Rather than a theory or an account of justice, environmental justice names a praxis, names a kind of action. It describes activist movements toward a just distribution of environmental goods, environmental harms and goods. By this point, it has been thoroughly documented that environmental harms fall disproportionately on communities of color. That's been the case for decades. And this is called environmental racism. Since the 1970s, environmental justice movements have emerged, and in many cases emerged from church communities, to confront environmental racism and environmental injustice. In doing so, they construct a vision of justice that is political, economic, and ecological all at once. And more recently, some advocates of environmental justice have begun to call for environmental reparations, such as environmental law professor Robin Morris Collin and Melanie Harris, who is an eco-womanist author, that is a writer doing environmental theology from the perspective of Black women. So these movements, these environmental justice movements, are enacting a transformative approach to justice. To turn now to environmental reparations. First, I want to recall my central claim for this lecture, that environmental reparations represent a transformative approach to justice that responds to the injustices of the Capitalocene by remaking the world. Why do transformative justice, why does world making lead to environmental action? As environmental justice activists have known and proclaimed for half a century, transformative or distributive views of justice necessarily lead to environmental action because the wrongs they seek to address and the systems they seek to transform are not only political and economic, but also ecological, the whole complex of what I've been calling the Capitalocene. For Taiwo, world making is an environmental project because the dominant issue facing this world, the world made by slavery and colonialism, is climate change. Climate change repeats the same inequalities of power established by colonialism and slavery. Formerly colonized countries are more vulnerable to climate change and to pollution than those that were never colonized. At the same time, climate change and pollution make those inequalities worse because climate migration and scarcity lead to increased political instability and increased conflict in those parts of the world. This is why reparations as world-making means environmental reparations. Reparative actions that seek justice for the historical wrongs of slavery and colonialism by enacting a social and ecological vision of what Taiwo calls a global community thoroughly structured by non-domination. One particularly important account of environmental reparations, and one that I've drawn on a lot in my own thinking, comes from environmental law. The environmental law scholar Catherine Kamen uses an example of persistent waste and pollution from a trash incinerator in Miami called Old Smoky. And using this example, she argues for a community-based approach to environmental reparations. This kind of approach should be aimed at reorganizing power by ensuring that communities suffering from environmental injustice have access to political and economic power so that they can not only overcome existing injustices, but can exercise greater control over their own future. Crucially, this community-based approach begins with the work of relationship building, by acknowledging enduring wrongs and by allowing the community itself to take the lead in discerning reparative actions. And these are some of the ideas that we've drawn on in our work. So I want to keep those characteristics in mind, but what we're talking about here is somewhat different from what she is describing. Kamen talks about reparations for environmental injustices in the recent past, something that has just happened, where the perpetrator and the community are both still around and readily identifiable, like the trash incinerator, Old Smoky. What we're talking about here is slightly different. We're talking about environmentally focused reparations for historical wrongs, specifically slavery. Because slavery made the current economic system, and because that system continues to distribute social and environmental harms and goods in unjust ways, because of those things, environmental reparations are about supporting community-based projects that offer some kind of alternative to the dominant unjust systems, with the goal of transformed relations among humans and between humans and the more than human world. So, for example, Taiwo endorses reparations projects that shift political agency, both locally through cash transfers, actually giving money to communities and community investment, and globally by changing climate agreements to provide much more funding for formerly colonized countries. For our own experiments, our goals have been similar to what Kamen and Taiwo describe, but on a more modest scale. Put simply, we hope to develop restored relationships that might lead to more just environmental, social, and political outcomes in communities affected by our institution's legacy of slavery and racism. Now, to our own experiments in world making, to our own work here. While many universities were founded in the slave societies of the Americas and reflected the influence and interests of men who engaged in the global slave trade, the University of the South was distinctive in being the only one launched expressly to serve, protect, advance the interests and needs of the civilization of bondage in the United States in the 1850s. The university's Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation has mapped the land holdings of the school's major founding slaveholding donors. For this particular experiment in world making, we focused on central Louisiana as a place where the oppressive history and enduring legacy of the university's founders were particularly acute. Our goal is what we refer to as micro-repair, reparative actions toward meaningful outcomes led by local partners in communities to whom we are connected by the university's historical connections to slaveholders. Meredith Calhoun, who pledged $5,000 to the founding of the university, owned one of the largest plantations in the central Louisiana area, and specifically right here is where we're talking about. His plantation was made up of 4 separate farms on the banks of the Red River. He enslaved nearly 1,000 people. He also acted as a broker for the purchase or sale of thousands more enslaved people. He was well known for his cruelty to his enslaved people. After the Civil War, the area around Calhoun's plantation, now the town of Colfax, became the site of what has been called the worst incident of racial violence during Reconstruction. As many as 150 Black men, most formerly enslaved on Calhoun's plantation, were massacred by a white militia that was trying to overthrow the newly elected, racially diverse government. Until recently, that massacre was memorialized in Colfax with a plaque that described it as a riot and portrayed the white militiamen as heroes. That massacre was only the most dramatic example of the ongoing oppression of the freedmen and their descendants, which, as we learned, continues in different forms today. In addition to Calhoun, several other donors in that area pledged a total of $52,500 for the founding of this university. The other major connection to the area was through one of the university's primary founders and one of its first chancellors, Leonidas Polk. Polk was the first bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Louisiana. Polk also owned a sugar plantation in southeastern Louisiana with an estimated 200 to 300 enslaved persons, and he served as lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. So based on these connections, we reached out to the Episcopal Diocese of Western Louisiana, which is responsible for this area here, who helped us identify and connect with other partners who were working with marginalized and disenfranchised and oppressed communities around Colfax and Alexandria. We also, with the help of Sewannee's GIS satellite mapping lab, we overlaid that funder's map with the Environmental Protection Agency's map of environmental justice and climate justice. These maps show air and water quality, Superfund hazardous waste sites, and sea level risks and flood risks, as well as showing places of high poverty and other socioeconomic factors. And the maps showed what you would expect, that the environmental hazards tended to be in lower income communities and communities of color in the areas that we were focusing on. So that was how we started our research into this. But we didn't focus our work only on what you might think of as environmental issues. The issues of the Anthropocene, or the Capitalocene epoch, show how interconnected ecological, political, and social systems are. One result of this is to expand the category of what we think of as an environmental issue. In the Capitalocene, housing, food access, education are all in some way environmental issues. Moreover, thinking back to the community-based approach that I described a moment ago, our goal from the beginning has been to learn from community partners what their most urgent concerns are and how we can best support those. It was important, therefore, to approach the work without the expectation of focusing on a particular kind of issue. So, for example, one particular collaboration that emerged, somewhat bittersweet, was finding avenues of support for the underfunded elementary school in Colfax. Since we began this work last year, that school has been closed down by the state. Additionally, though, research demonstrates that climate resilience, resilience in the face of climate change, requires community resilience. Strong community relationships in the form of community organizations or networks, which could have included a strong local school, can mean the difference between communities that can adapt adequately to climate impacts like flooding and hurricanes, and to those that can't. So again, efforts to increase political power and accountability, efforts to increase the social capital of a community have environmental significance in a time of climate catastrophe. But some of the issues that we have learned about and begun to engage with do have a clear sort of conventionally environmental justice aspect to them. In an example very similar to the Old Smoky case, the trash incinerator in Miami, an impoverished, predominantly Black community in Colfax has been the site of an open burn and open detonation facility for hazardous military waste for nearly 40 years. The community there is engaged in efforts to get that site closed down, but even beyond that, There's a struggle for remediation, that is for cleaning up the site, and for some kind of justice for this community that has suffered for generations from the health and environmental impacts of this waste. Another example is agriculture. Agriculture, of course, was especially important to the history of racial capitalism in the United States. And so it can be a really important site for healing relationships. Another prospective partner that we have been working with, or have begun working with in that area, is a cooperative of Black farmers who are developing a more sustainable and efficient method of farming rice that also gives them more economic control and autonomy and more stability to the farmers. This project is a radical alternative to industrial exploitative agriculture that is a direct descendant from the monocrop plantation agriculture that I was describing. So this is truly an example of the kind of world making. This experiment is still in the early stages. The forms of these partnerships is still being discerned. We're currently developing grant proposals to support these and other projects to continue developing these relationships. For example, by trying to bring community leaders to campus and continuing to meet with them to learn how the university might support their work. And in fact, this slow pace of relationship work has been one of the most important aspects of this project. If justice in the Capitalocene requires the creation of new worlds that involve new ways of relating to other humans and to the more than human world, if, as Catherine Kamen says, concrete reparations should come after the work of recognition, of allowing the community to define itself and to direct the shape of the work. For all these reasons, the patient work of building mutual trust is an essential starting place for environmental reparations. We can say that we have begun this work, and perhaps that it's off to a promising start. For reparations to be impactful, though, the ultimate goal has to be for the university to make a significant material investment in communities from whose exploitation it benefited. We see this work that we've begun, this relationship building work, as establishing a necessary foundation toward that goal. Beyond that, though, similar efforts need to be undertaken toward relationship repair and land restitution, that is, giving the land back, with the variety of indigenous peoples who considered sacred the land on which we are sitting right now. And finally, none of this can take the place of national, society-wide reparations for what was the state-sanctioned system of physical, economic, and environmental violence within racial capitalism. In conclusion, the example of our ongoing work with the Episcopal Diocese of Louisiana and the communities in central Louisiana illustrates how environmental reparations fit this idea of world making and a transformative account of justice. Remaking the world built by colonialism and slavery, the world of the Capitalocene, requires efforts at restored relationships among human communities and between human and ecological communities. It requires a holistic understanding of how social, political, and environmental systems and injustices mutually reinforce one another, particularly along racial lines. It requires the historical work of recognizing and naming how the legacies of slavery and colonialism continue to shape the distribution of harms and goods, such that some continue to benefit from those legacies and some continue to suffer. And it requires that those of us who do benefit make a real, substantial, material investment in those communities that continue to bear the burdens. This is what makes this work reparative. This is what makes it justice. In themselves, of course, projects like this do not transform a capitalist world ecology. Remaking the world, if such a thing is even possible, involves advocacy for major institutional and systemic changes. Again, things like land restitution and climate financing. But small-scale relational efforts like these can, I believe, demonstrate what justice might look like in the Capitalocene. They can perhaps offer glimpses, however partial, of world making. Thank you all for your attention. And